Thank you and good evening. Many years ago, I was walking in the Kremlin garden with Boris Yeltsin. And I said to Boris, tell me, in one word, what is the state of Russia? He said, good. I was surprised it was falling to pieces. I said, tell me in 2 words. He said, not good. I suppose in the argument on Europe, we have 2 sides divided in exactly that fashion. I propose to talk about the referendum on Europe this evening, but first, a word about these lovely surroundings. For me, they're a touch surreal. As a boy, the likelihood of someone from my background in Brixton in the 1950s and early 60s, the likelihood of someone from my background going to university was remote. University was for others, and Oxford would certainly have been a dream too far. And so I left school, and I joined a bank, and I offered to be posted to Nigeria during the middle of the Biafran War. Reckless perhaps, but it paid better than London. And as I was young and easily replaced in the bank, my offer to go was accepted with, I thought, rather too much enthusiasm by the senior officials, and so I went. And whilst I was there, I saw and experienced things that were their very own education. But that said, I do envy you your time at one of our great universities. Later, it will bring obligations to yourself, your families, your community, your country, and maybe even beyond. And I wish you well when you come to those obligations. Now, this is my first public, well, semi-public speech in the referendum campaign, and I'm delighted that it's here because it's your future and that of your generation that will be enhanced or diminished by whether we remain in Europe or leave it. And over the years, in my personal experiences with European politicians, I've learned that we and our continental partners often misunderstand one another. Now, some of you will know of President Delors, President of the Commission in the 1980s and early 1990s, a French socialist, a talented, attractive man. Nice instincts, not always such good policies. And when I first became Prime Minister, I went to meet him. And we had the sort of meeting that one always has between 2 people who know they are destined to disagree on almost everything. And we were trying to make such friendships as we could. And he's very charming, and he decided we would speak in his broken English rather than my broken French, a wise decision. And after a while, he began a long monologue about this great statesman, a Dutchman, I thought, called Douglas. And Douglas was wonderful. Douglas understood Europe. There was nothing about Europe that Douglas was not complete master of. And if only all Europe had the sense, the skill, the sensitivity of Douglas, all would be well. And I thought to myself, as a novice Prime Minister of a couple of weeks, who is this Dutchman of whom I've never heard? And it suddenly occurred to me in his broken English that he was actually speaking about Douglas Hurd, the British Foreign Secretary. We often misunderstand one another. Now, I've no particular reason to be a supporter of the European Union. It is far from perfect, let's not pretend otherwise. A quarter of a century ago, it bitterly divided my party, and European disagreements wrecked many of the ambitions that I personally had for my time as Prime Minister. It opened disputes that linger yet. Nor am I an unquestioning European. I did, after all, say no to the euro, no to joining the Schengen Agreement on open borders. And I also said no to the so-called social chapter, because it seemed to me it helped people who were in work, but at the expense of those who were looking for work and could not find it, and that didn't seem to me to be just in any regard. Even so, I passionately believe we must remain in Europe and help shape its future. Geography, trade, and logic mean our futures are linked, whether we wish it to be so or not. And tonight I want to talk a little about why I believe that's so, and then cast a friendly but critical eye over the flawed and misleading arguments for leaving Europe. What sort of country are we? For hundreds of years we've been, I believe, a positive force in the world, a nation that looked outward and spread our ideas, our principles, our laws, our democracy to the far corners of the world. But that world has changed. Today we are 65 million people, less than 1% of a world of 7,000 million, forecast to become 9,000 million by the time your children are sitting here in this great university. And the global market is inexorably drawing that world together on a scale and at a speed that we could not have imagined even a few years ago. And it's counterintuitive in that world to suddenly decide to go it alone, as our friends around the world tell us it would be a disastrously bad decision to do so. Within the European Union, we're a large and an influential nation. And while we remain a part of that union of 500 million people, we have serious political and diplomatic clout as well as economic advantages. And some examples perhaps illustrate this point. Whilst in Europe, we were able to impose sanctions on Russia to keep her in check and deter further misbehaviour in Ukraine. We were able to persuade the European Union as a whole to join America and impose sanctions on Iran to help bring about a deal that halted development of an Iranian nuclear weapon. We couldn't have done that alone. If we were to leave, our friends in the world would consider us diminished. Departure would be a gratuitous act of self-harm. The economic argument for Europe seems to me to be overwhelming. It's nearly half our export market, 5 times bigger than the market of all the 52 Commonwealth countries added together, and 6 times more than the sum total of trade with Brazil, Russia, India, and China. In the European Union, we have unimpeded access to the richest trade market the world has ever seen, right here on our doorstep. And access to that market of 500 million people encourages a wall of investment to come into the United Kingdom. Ask yourself this simple question. If you were an overseas investor, would you be more likely to invest in a British market of 65 million people, or in Britain as the access point to a European market of 500 million people? To ask the question is to know the answer. And that investment isn't just an abstract statistic. It's jobs, it's tax yield, it's profits, and it's a contribution to our public services and our overall quality of life. Outside Europe, outside the European Union, we'd still have to comply with EU rules and regulations unless we surrendered all access to the single market, which all reputable authorities, not least the IMF, the OECD, the Institute of Economic and Social Research, the Bank of England, and many others, all regard as economically foolish. And once out of Europe, or liberated in the more emotive language of the Leave campaign, we could no longer protect ourselves against the impact of European laws on the City of London, nor on our industries and service sectors. Nominally, we would indeed be free, but in practice, we would only be free to accept whatever the European Union determined, with no power as a non-member to argue against it. Is that taking back control as the Leave campaign describes it? No, it isn't. And it's not glorious sovereignty either. It's nothing other than reckless, imprudent folly. And the price for that would be paid by every single British family in our country. And it isn't the only price. The Institute of Economic and Social Research warns us of a collapse in the value of sterling. The LSE warns of higher prices. The Bank of England fears higher mortgage rates and mortgages. All this and more from a whole range of independent bodies. There is no independent body that has suggested otherwise than this. All that and more is ignored and brushed aside by the Leave campaign. And yet, many people, not least in my own party, wish us to leave Europe. Their motives are many and variable, and they're often good motives. Pride in our country, concern over sovereignty and immigration, fear that we have no influence in Europe, and are heading for a federal structure. And we need to address those instincts, those emotions, and debunk the myths that are about that are simply wrong, but nonetheless sunk in our national consciousness. And if we fail to do so, we may end up leaving Europe because of absurd falsehoods that are widely believed to be true. One absurdity is that this country, subsumed in Europe, would lose its traditions, its heritage, its individuality. Well, we won't. After 60 years of Europe, are the French less French? Are the Germans less German? I think not, and nor will we be less British. In the search for voter support, the Leave campaign repeatedly overstate their case. If they were to win, they risk a backlash from those who might then reasonably say that they were misled by their campaign. There is no shortage of their exaggerations. One clear example, of course, is the cost of Europe. Mr. Farage, Mr. Duncan Smith, and Mr. Johnson all put it as £20 billion a year. It's even on Boris's battle bus. Michael Gove is a little more modest at 18 billion. A touch of disagreement there. All of which we are told by the Leave campaign, all of which, if only we were free of Europe, could be spent on the health service and in particular our hospitals. If only. If only. But the truth is their figures are wrong by a factor of 3. During the last 5 years, the average gross payment was not 20 billion, but just over 12 billion, of which 5.5 billion was paid back to us. Last year, our gross payment had fallen because the budget was cut, partly as a result of the Prime Minister's interventions. So the gross payment for the last year we have figures was just over 11 billion, of which over 5 billion was paid back to our farmers, our businesses, science, research, and regional aid. Some of it came here to Oxford. Now, that isn't my calculation. That is the calculation of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. So to put the 20 billion more into hospitals that the Leave campaign promised daily, they would have to claw back all that money paid to our fellow countrymen. Good luck with that, with the farmers and the researchers. And then on top of that, tax the nation by an additional 10 billion or so. And I think those who make such demonstrably false claims, knowingly do so, need to apologize that they have got their figures so badly wrong and stop peddling a clear-cut untruth. They have repeatedly been asked to do so by the chairman of the UK Statistics Authority, and still they have failed to comply. And then, of course, the Leave campaign fret that we have surrendered our sovereignty to Europe. Now that seems to me to be a very rum claim. If it were true, how could we now be offering our nation a referendum at all? It's certainly true that we have shared sovereignty. We share ours, and in return, we gain a share of the sovereignty of 27 other nations. But that is our choice, because it is in our national interest. And if it ever ceased to be, our government can always commence withdrawal from Europe with the support of our Parliament. So let me make it absolutely clear as far as sovereignty is concerned. We share it with our colleagues in the European Union only for so long as the British Parliament wishes us to do so. And even that sharing is only partial. What say does the European Union have over our economic policy? None. Our education system? None. Our NHS? None. Our welfare system? None. Our armed forces? None. Our police? None. I could go on. 98% of government spending in the UK is entirely in the control of the British Parliament. And like so much we hear from the Leave campaign, the sovereignty argument is emotive but utterly specious. In a global economy these days, no country truly has sovereignty, not even our mighty friends in the United States. And in our most crucial area, security, we have happily shared sovereignty within NATO with our European partners and the United States for over 60 years. Now, of course, in Europe, we don't always get our own way. Who does in any relationship of two? If anyone present in a relationship of two always gets their own way, please put up their hands, see me afterwards, and tell me how they do it. So who does in a relationship of two, let alone a relationship that numbers 27 other member states? But in well over 90% of all the votes cast in Brussels, the UK wins. The caricature that we are repeatedly voted down in Europe, frankly, is ill-informed nonsense. Another cherished Leave mantra is that we'll all be dragged into a federal Europe. You can see the expression when that is said. It is the Brexiteers' favourite horror story. But yet again, it's fantasy. Were we dragged into the euro? Well, no, we weren't. Were we dragged into Schengen and open borders? Well, as a matter of fact, we weren't. Are we now exempt from ever closer union? Yes, we are, which David Cameron was told he would never win in negotiation, but did. And yet it had been there since the European treaties were first formed. And if there is any more treaty, any other treaty, any new treaty that seeks more power from Britain, that treaty would have to be put to the British nation in a national referendum, and if, and only if, it were approved by our own citizens, would it become law. One final point on sovereignty. We have sovereignty in its purest and most potent form. We, the United Kingdom, can leave the European Union at any time of our choosing. Nothing legally binds us to the European Union in perpetuity. That is the fact, and we should disregard the fiction. As the various Leave arguments implode one by one, some, not all, but some of the Brexit leaders morph into UKIP and turn to their default position, immigration. This is their trump card. I urge them to take care. This is dangerous territory that, if handled carelessly, can open up long-term divisions in our country. I grew up in Brixton in the 1950s and 60s, a time of massive immigration from the West Indies. As a boy, I played in local parks with the children of those immigrants. Some of those newcomers rented rooms in the same house as my family. So I can tell you, as a matter of fact, not fantasy, that those I knew then and later didn't come here for our benefits. They came halfway across the world to give themselves and their families a better life, and I admired them for that. At the time, fears were fanned by careless statements from political figures. That was a mistake then, and it would be a mistake now. Do not misunderstand me. Of course, it is legitimate to raise the issue of the sheer numbers of people wishing to enter our country. Of course it's legitimate. I wholly accept that. Nor do I wish to silence debate. We must never overlook genuine concerns. But these should be expressed with care, with honesty, and with balance, not in a manner that can raise fears or fuel prejudice. The Leave campaign are crossing that boundary, and I caution them not to do so. They attribute motives to new arrivals that are speculative, and it seems to me, frankly, offensive. They highlight, with grotesque exaggeration, the risk of mass migration from Turkey. Turkey, a country that is unlikely to be joining the European Union anytime soon, and indeed may never do so. And even if she did, the terms of her accession would need to be agreed by every member state, including the United Kingdom. And France, of course, has already offered her citizens a referendum on this application. So when the Leave campaign warn of, and I quote, opening our borders to 88 million people, they mean Turkey, but also the Western Balkans. They cross the boundaries of responsible comment. It is unlikely in the extreme that, and I quote, another 88 million people will soon be eligible for NHS care and school places for their children. Now, I assume that this distortion of reality was intended to lead the British people into believing that almost the entire population of possible new entrants will all wish to relocate in the United Kingdom. If so, if that was the intention, it is pure demagoguery. I hope that when the heat of the referendum is behind us, the proponents of such mischief-making will be embarrassed and ashamed at how they have misused this issue. And they advance a second migration red herring, that the recent modest rise in our national living wage will be, I quote, irresistible to would-be migrants. This is very dubious. First of all, 40% of migrants are under 25 and wouldn't be eligible in the first place. Second, are people really motivated to cross an entire continent to receive a few pence a week extra? I very much doubt it. What an odd conversation it must be somewhere in North Africa or Syria. I hear the British have put up the national living wage. Let's go there. But even if they did have that conversation, why come to the UK when the minimum wage is higher in France? And wage levels are higher in other countries that have no statutory minimum. The Leave argument here is copper-bottomed nonsense. But what of the numbers argument, which is genuine? There are various categories of migrants. Commonwealth immigration is entirely unaffected by our membership of the European Union. Would-be migrants from around the world need skilled worker visas to enter. and these are under our control. Refugees are dealt with on a case-by-case basis. Many of those applying for citizenship have lost everything they have ever had, and we have always been a compassionate nation to take them in. But these decisions, again, are under our control. And then there are clearly undesirables who we can and already do exclude. This includes anyone where there is concern over national security or criminal activity or even adverse immigration history. This too is already under our control. But yes, if we were to leave Europe, we could exclude more European Union citizens, such, for example, as the 54,000 European migrants now working as doctors or nurses or ancillaries in our health service, or the nearly 80,000 working in social care. We could exclude skilled workers like builders and plumbers, or unskilled labour that takes jobs that we British traditionally find unappealing. In short, the people we could most easily keep out are the very people that we most need. A balanced approach would acknowledge the contribution of migrants to our national well-being. Without their contribution, the health service wouldn't be able to cope, nor would our public transport system. And our hotels, restaurants and shops would be without staff to serve their customers. We would have a shortage of many skills for industry. Now that is the reality that lies beneath the emotive language of those who seek to raise the drawbridge on our country. The problem of numbers will not be forever. The growth of the Eurozone economy, now clearly underway, should cut demand to come here as jobs grow elsewhere across Europe. But in any event, a short-term migrancy flow should not be the issue that drives the United Kingdom out of an economic union that benefits our country immensely and will continue to do so in the future. Now, I asked earlier, what sort of country are we? And I ask now, what sort of people are we? Under our undemonstrative exterior, the British, I believe, are an essentially kind and benevolent nation, and more inclined to emotion than the age-old caricature of stiff upper lips would ever have people believe. Show us charitable need, and we dig deep. Show us children in need, and we pay up happily. Show us people starving in Africa, and we text our contributions by the million. Show us a faraway nation suffering from a great national disaster, and we rush to help. We do so because our emotions are touched. But we shouldn't let these emotions be stirred by false fear, nor allow false fear to impair our judgment on the future of our country. Over the next few weeks, we, the British people, will decide the future direction of our country. This is not a general election which rolls around every 5 years. We can't suck it and see this referendum. There won't be another referendum on Europe. This is it. This is where we take the decision. So, whatever your view, register and vote, because the decision you take on the 23rd of June will shape our country, our people, and our livelihoods for many generations to come. Thank you very much.